Hey everybody, welcome back to the Results Junkies podcast. Paul, we have some housekeeping to do this morning. You know you're on the spot, and you knew after me missing the mark on this last week, I wasn't going to miss twice in a row. So, question of the day: have you given Matt Paulson his link?
It will be going out this afternoon, and you will be copied on that email.
Timestamp Friday morning, March 1st. Just I don't want you to be able to drop this the day the episode drops and have people be like, "Oh, he's on time."
No, I'm gonna get my ghetto but useful version out today.
Somebody once knew said if you don't hate the first version of your product, you probably waited too long to release it.
Man, that guy sounds super smart. I would keep him around.
So for folks who are just tuning in, show at resultsjunkies.com is how you find us. He is at Paul Singh on all those social media channels. I am at Pizza in Motion. And if you are on social media occasionally, you might see this image coming up soon, just for further proof. Thank you, Alex, by the way. Further proof that that life in an RV is all that and a bag of Fritos. In fact, I think I can see the bag of Fritos under the trailer as you change the tire there in Lubbock.
And Alex, by the way, now that I realize that I owe you an email. I saw an email from you here a day or two ago. So by the time this episode drops, you will have gotten a response from me, and we will likely have traded a couple.
The follow-up, the follow-up that is stacking up in this episode is incredible this morning. Incredible. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about AI for the first time in 20 minutes this week. We got some stuff on Google's Gemini and a left-hand turn that they probably wished it hadn't taken. You surfaced an interesting tweet on how Klarna is using AI. Klarna, one of the big BNPL, buy now, pay later companies that's changing how payments are done. Let's start with layoffs. I sent you a couple links this morning. We were looking at layoffs.fyi, which we've tracked for quite some time. And I also sent you the news about the Cisco layoffs. Cisco is the 1992 version of NVIDIA. You bought Cisco hardware. It was like buying Maytag or GE. That's where NVIDIA is today. And it's just an interesting full circle to see Cisco shedding this many jobs while NVIDIA is growing at exponential rates.
One of my first businesses was data centers and is data centers. We still have a bunch of them here operating. Your comment about Cisco being sort of the NVIDIA of 1992, I think that's probably accurate because they exploded as the internet came online and as data centers started to grow. The thing about it is that these days they're not necessarily a sexy company by any means, but the reality is that you walk into my data centers or any other data centers, you're still going to see, you look at the top of the racks or however the architecture is, wherever you're at, you're pretty much going to see only Cisco and Juniper. So my point is they are like the NVIDIA of 1992, but their infrastructure, you don't get fired for buying Cisco gear. It works.
I think what I took away from it is if you're a Fortune 500 company and you have 80,000 employees, which is what this article infers, they cut 5% of their workforce, which was 40,000 jobs. If you're a Fortune 500 company whose stock is performing well and you have 80,000 employees, you are absolutely still very relevant.
Oh, absolutely. Jobs that were shed were not, core product. What they're shedding, I think, is sort of, the excess that a lot of companies picked up in that zero interest rate environment of a couple of years ago. You and I have talked about this over the last couple episodes. What we're seeing in terms of all these layoffs is not some fundamental recession coming down the pipe, I don't think. It's really more just a reset back to the mean.
It's a right sizing. Yeah.
It's a right sizing. That's right. But it's good to see. I mean, look, for people to kind of picture this in their head when we talk about a ripple, imagine having, hundreds of thousands of accounts for your employees, and then you shed 40,000 of them. Eventually, when it comes time for renewal with Google, your account is 40,000 seats lighter. And so then a couple quarters later, somebody like Google says, hey, our accounts are down or whatever. And that's maybe a bad analogy, but maybe it helps people kind of like visualize it a little bit better.
Well, I think it's directionally accurate because if we scroll down the list on layoffs.fyi, Fisker, Electronic Arts, Sony Interactive, Bumble, Expedia, BuzzFeed, Rivian. Cisco's not on there yet, but I'm sure they will be. What's the one thing that all those companies have in common? Well, you know what? They all use email. They all use a messaging app, Teams,
Right.
Slack, whatever.
They
So,
probably have a CRM. They
mhm,
probably have,
yep, yep.
expense accounts, which means like, the local restaurants don't get paid as much or, get as much spend. There's a lot of ripple effects here.
There are a lot of ripple effects, and I think I mean, businesses are more and more heavily reliant on SaaS to help them go, and they scale to a point. But as you know, like at a certain point, that there just isn't that much more scale, if you will, and so smaller companies, smaller SaaS providers get hurt more by this stuff, I would imagine, because they're not necessarily dealing with enterprise customers, are dealing with folks who are on monthly or annual plans.
Right.
So,
That's right. That's right.
as a complete side note, I actually got onboarded to a product. There's this product called Hoop. It essentially uses a version of transcription, something near and dear to your heart, and it creates tasks. So Hoop is sitting in on my Zoom calls, and it's peeking into my Slack, and it's telling me when a discussion bubbles up a task item. And, I've got a bunch of tasks from Zoom calls I had yesterday. Ask Todd about the last conversation regarding the white label preferred model and follow up with a company I can't name. So, are they all helpful? Are they all grammatically correct? No, I mean, it's early days. And I think we're going to get into that in a second. Like a company like Hoop, I would imagine is not at an enterprise level yet. They're finding B2B opportunities, and they're onboarding folks. And so in a growth environment, they've got plenty of room to grow. And in an environment where things are shrinking and they want to charge people for things, it's going to be harder for companies that are laying employees off to justify the next SaaS product.
When you texted me the link for this, for
Hmm.
layoffs FYI, it's just astounding to me that just a week or two ago it said 35,000 on that list, in terms of layoffs in 2024. And now it's at, I think at the time of this recording, it's just about 50,000.
Yep.
Um, and that's only self-reported. So there's my point is these numbers are probably lower than the actuals, but that's just wild.
We may have leveled out, but if we have leveled out, I just certainly don't think we're in growth mode just yet. Because
Yeah,
some of the stuff that's
that's fair.
some of the stuff that's getting sorted out. I mean, yeah, Cisco can lay off 4,000 employees and still be a viable entity. Electronic Arts, Fisker having car troubles, Rivian, like some of these are existential threat sort of things.
Yep.
I don't know a lot about the dating world, thankfully. Um, Bumble laid off. Bumble is a dating service. They laid off 30% of their employees. I mean, that's never a good sign. It's still a lumpy world out there. And honestly, like, I mean, interest rates drive a lot of this.
The thing is like you and I play a lot in the early stage private startup world, and the
Mhm.
reality is that failure is pretty fast. Like companies fail either before they get funded or within a year or two of getting funded. That's pretty fast, all things considered.
Yeah.
But on the other extreme, when you think about these larger Fortune 500 companies like Cisco, or even like newer publicly traded companies, I think Bumble's publicly traded now as well. They're sitting on much larger cash accounts. It just takes a little bit more time for them to hit. So I think in terms of like the layoffs coming and stuff like that. So I think we see these numbers rising on layoffs, FYI, so fast because privately held companies, when there's a problem, there's nobody coming to save them, so they've got to cut as fast as they can. But
Right.
on the public market side, they're not thinking payroll to payroll like startups are. They're thinking, quarter to quarter. They're thinking annually, and so anecdotally, if we've started to see more public companies starting to lay off, I think you could anecdotally extrapolate that out a little bit and say that maybe there's still more coming. It's not like we're done with Cisco and Bumble. Like that's
Right.
not the end of it.
Right.
Uh,
Right. No, I
so
agree. I agree. Let's talk AI since we've, never talked about that on the show.
people want to know.
So I sent you an article, and there was some other stuff that sort of came out of this because you had sent me that tweet on Klarna. Let's start with the Google article because I think it's a good piece to sort of like peel back the layers on for how people feel about AI right now. And we'll link to this article in the show notes. But essentially, Google has their version of ChatGPT called Gemini. We talked about it recently on the show. They started charging for it, and the engine started generating images of historical events that were not historically accurate. So, the example that was widely publicized on the internet was that it was generating pictures of black Nazis, or a black George Washington, things that are historically inaccurate. And it probably wouldn't have raised much of my attention, but I do listen to a lot of other podcasts, as you know, and I was listening to the All In podcast, and their take on this was quite jarring, in my opinion, because they jumped on the fact that this symbolized that Google was woke, and that this was like some sort of intentional effort. And I just, like, without even getting into the politics of it, I just kept coming back to, we are watching probably the largest build in public scenario I've seen in my career. Like, all of these products, all of this AI stuff is so publicly being built in front of our eyes, more so than anything else. And there are going to be millions of mistakes. And I think that's what I keep coming back to with this.
I couldn't agree more. I think the people that are passing judgment on AI, machine learning, large language models, whatever you want to call, because I feel like for better or for worse, everybody's mixing and matching those terms anyway. The thing is, the people that are passing judgment on this right now are pretty smart, but they're kind of armchair quarterbacking something that is much more complicated. And the simple way that I would explain this to people is that, computer science, just broadly speaking, computer science hasn't changed much in 50, 60, 70 years. I mean, put aside the hardware side, like transistors have gotten smaller and all that stuff, right? But computer science on the whole, when we think about the code side of it, has not changed much. What a software developer has done for the last 50, 60 years is essentially build a black box with code, and you put an input into that black box, the code does something, and then it spits an output out of that black box. If the output is not what you expect it to be, then it's a pretty straightforward exercise to go back into the code, into the black box, and find the problem. Computers generally in that model just do what they're told. Even if you gave it the wrong code, it's just going to do what it's told. The profound shift with machine learning and large language models and all that stuff is that humans aren't necessarily writing every line of code anymore. This is way more complex. You're passing in terabytes of data, maybe even petabytes of data into these training models. These things have to train for millions of GPU hours to get to where they are. As if that's not enough, then you have to prompt them. So like, you and I might be working side by side and say like, okay, we're going to generate an image of a playground. Like, in our mind, we're conceptually aligned, but if you write the prompt and I write the prompt, it'll be subtly different because we're two different human beings. The All In guys are super smart. Clearly they are, right? And putting aside politics and all that for a moment, all these people that are just making these broad armchair quarterback style comments, they're sort of missing the complexity of what it takes to get here. Like, by the way, I'm not saying there's not any bias, because I think every human has a slight amount of bias. That's just how humans have been. That's how we evolved, like, but to like blanket just say, oh, look, they're woke or whatever, that just misses the whole point, because there's no conspiracy theory with AI. We're in the early stages of build in public, just like you said. And the reality is that, here's the uncomfortable truth. I think in the early days of computer science, it was just as crazy. It was just as broken. The only difference is we didn't have Twitter for people to run their mouths.
Two things too. The computer wasn't capable of drawing George Washington. The set of parameters that it could operate in were much narrower. The sidelines and the goalposts were now it's massive. I mean,
Oh yeah.
the compute power of my phone, is massive compared to all those early models.
I think one of the ways to really be thinking about AI and machine learning and large language models is to actively stop using those terms. In each of our minds, those terms, just like any other terms floating through our brain, have some sort of internal bias, whether we like them or not. That's just kind of how it is. What if we just stopped using those terms and just started thinking about the applications here? Probably over a decade ago, I remember coming back from a trip. This is before I knew you. Coming back from a trip, I didn't have fancy friends like you with global status or whatever. And I remember United like lost my baggage or something like that, and I needed to wait. Well, we had invested in this little startup called Twilio, had this little API. And so I built a little mobile app that, I'm sorry, a website where it would just wait on hold for me. I figured out, okay, what's the key sequence to get me to somebody? And in the earliest days of that I recall of the Twilio API, you could then program in those sequences, right? Like press one and then wait and da da da. And then there was an API, a part of the API where it would just say, it will tell you when a human starts talking. As soon as it detected that, it would call me and I could then connect. Now, fast forward 10, 12, 15 years, we're going to talk about Klarna here in a minute, but if we put aside those buzzwords I just mentioned, how much more impactful would it be if it wasn't just simple if then else statements,
Right. Right.
How many times have you and I been on a call? Well, normal people like me actually have to call customer support. I feel like people, but but like when I call customer support, how many times have you guys like heard the prompt where it's like, please listen closely, our prompt menus have changed or whatever?
Every single time.
Well, they don't do that because they're innovating. They do that because they're fighting against the auto dialers that people like me built over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Right. But how profoundly does that change if your code doesn't have to do if then else statements and can actually listen to what the thing's saying, transcribe it in real time, understand it, and then respond? That's profound.
Yes.
Absolutely profound. We're in the earliest days of this stuff. And what you're witnessing now is like one of the most profound build in public things ever. And it's probably the same as it was 60 years ago when people figured out the transistor. The difference is like news traveled slower.
Yeah. Failure was much less public back then.
Yeah. By the time the New York Times wrote about it on their national edition, a year had passed probably, and and all the kinks had been worked out. So I don't know. But again, look, I'm an optimist. There you go. There's one of my biases, right? Like, everybody wants to point at like the bad images, which I get. It's a problem.
It's also much more visible than the tweet that you sent me about Klarna. And I think that's the key here is that unless somebody like Klarna tells us what's happening, we don't really know. So I'll paraphrase this tweet, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. This was a executive from Klarna saying that the Klarna's AI assistant, which is powered by OpenAI, has in its first 4 weeks handled 2.3 million customer service chats. The data insights are staggering. Handled 2/3 of customer service inquiries, on par with humans for customer satisfaction. Higher accuracy led to a 25% reduction in repeat inquiries. Customer resolves their errands in 2 minutes versus 11 minutes. And then, honestly, what I think is the biggest piece of this, and again, I'll hear your thoughts. Live 24/7 in over 23 markets, communicating in over 35 languages.
Right. Didn't he say something like it did the work of 700 employees?
The equivalent of 700 full-time agents, yes.
It's moving way faster than people realize, and I think the latest reports are that OpenAI is already making over $1 billion a year.
Right.
Somebody's using it. So we can talk trash about it, let people like kind of armchair quarterback it all day. But make no mistake that if there is an advantage to be had here, business is already exploiting it. And I think Klarna is probably one of the earliest ones to actually now go out and say what they've done. I have this theory, and it's not based in any science, but it's just something I've been thinking about for years. Whenever I meet early stage founders and I ask them what they read about, inevitably they always say something about like, oh, I like this account and that blog or whatever. And they bring up terms like growth hacking.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I always say to these founders is like, pause for a minute. Let's think about this for real. If that growth hacker, whoever you love to read tweets or blogs about, if they really are that good, why would they be writing about this? Well, the answer is they're writing about it because all the alpha is gone. Meaning, once you've exploited the value of the tactic, the next best thing to do is to talk about it and maybe exploit maybe the eyeballs that come from it. They've already moved on to the actual tactics that are now working for them. They're just blogging about the stuff that stopped working but was useful a couple weeks or months ago. So when you think about it as an early stage founder, you shouldn't be reading what these people talked about or said worked. What you really should be doing is trying to build relationships with them, because you want to figure out what's working today, not what worked 6 months ago. Same thing here with AI. If Klarna has already seen the value of 700 employees through these APIs, what they're probably doing today is already leaps and bounds ahead of that. They're just not ready to talk about it.
It's a good point, one that I hadn't thought of.
I'm glad they talk about it though now, because when that tweet went out, a lot of the people in the corp dev departments of large publicly traded companies that I've known over the last 10, 12 years, right? Because when you're an early stage investor, a lot of the times these people are buying your companies 5, 7, 10 years later. And so when I sent that tweet out to you, I also texted it to a bunch of corp dev people. And immediately people sat up, because for quote unquote normal business people, they don't care how it's done, AI, LLM, whatever the jargon is. They saw the 700 employee number. And to them, they're like, well, hang on. If I'm in banking, let's just make this up for example, just so people understand this. They don't care what a prompt is. They don't care how this all works. What caught their attention was, hey, I'm a large company and my customer service staff, let's just say, broadly costs $60,000 fully loaded annually. Multiply that by 700. Holy cow, I could buy some of these early stage, should I be buying some of these early stage companies in this space to start exploiting some of this? That's what they're thinking. Klarna talking about this now hopefully will prompt more and more other companies to talk about what might have worked for them as well. And the more that happens, the more you're going to see mainstream companies start to pick this up.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate for a second here. I'm not sure if all instances are good instances. So, and I'm gonna mention three things. First off, we talked about the fact that we're using a version of an AI robot to take phone orders at our restaurants.
Are you still doing that? I remember you talking about that a few months ago. Are you still doing it?
We are. We haven't seen a growth in phone orders. You could argue we've seen a decrease in phone orders, and so that's one thing. The other thing that's not mentioned in the Klarna article is what their customer satisfaction scores were before.
That's
And I
fair.
think you would agree that there are different levels of customer service when it comes to that human interaction level. So I think I'd really need to understand how Klarna handles customer service today. And then to your point about how companies would employ this, American Airlines is changing how they clear people for standby on flights. So if you're trying to run and catch an earlier flight and you don't have top tier status on American Airlines now, you need to use a self-service option. An agent will not help you. You have to go through the app or something else to put yourself on the standby list. And the big key is it has to be 45 minutes prior to the flight departing. In the very abstract, for those not watching on TV, I have my arms spread wide across. I think things like Klarna, what we're doing with the restaurants, and what American Airlines is doing are all good examples of how this technology can be employed. But I don't think we've measured customer retention yet. And Klarna is one BNPL option. It's also one payment option. And so if I have a great experience with the Klarna bot, then it may increase my level of stickiness to the brand. And if I don't have a great experience with it, my personal opinion, and I could be wrong, my personal opinion is if you have a bad experience with somebody's chatbot, today you probably have more violent feelings about it or more visceral reactions, and you probably go find the human, if you will, from someplace else.
Well, it's context specific, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So for example, if I'm a traveler and my flight got delayed and now I need to get rerouted, what I need both emotionally and rationally is probably a human to quickly route me around the problem, hopefully, and help me and all that stuff. So in that context, the possible downside of a chatbot is not useful. But let's just kind of take a wild guess at what the average support request is for Klarna. It's probably what's my balance, or when is my next payment,
Mhm.
or how do I pay?
Yeah.
Like what's at risk if the conversation goes sideways is a lot less for something like that than if I was like, hey, I need to be home in time for my kids' track
Right.
meet. Hey, get me there,
Mhm. No,
like
I agree.
so it's context specific. And I think when I think about ordering on the phone, I don't think about Five Guys that way. Like I don't like if I'm going to get Five Guys, it's typically like I either drove past it or I know I'm driving past it. I'm just going to walk in there and do it. Or if there was an app, I guess I would just press the button on the app. Like I don't think about calling in an order anymore.
I think this goes to demographics because I agree. You're never calling me or you're never calling one of my restaurants to place an order, but you're also probably not calling any restaurant to place an order that has any other method to place it. So the only example I give, I mean, I know where you live, so I don't think this exists, but like for me in Leesburg, Virginia, the Chinese food place that we like to order from when we order Chinese, they don't. I mean, I guess they have something on their website that kind of sort of works, but it's so awful. Like it's so god
That's
awful.
fair.
And so I
Yeah.
will call them because it's the only effective way to place an order. But short of that, when was the last time you called somebody to place a food order for your family?
No, I mean, I'm very similar to you. Like there is a local Chinese place right outside the neighborhood here that we probably get once a month, maybe twice a month, and I call them.
Right, right.
So that's probably the only one I call in. But again, that might be just what it's like in Northern Virginia. I don't know.
No, I don't think so. Because I mean, like, as you know, I travel, and I see this, many places, and like typically I'll use Google Maps to look for restaurants, and then I'll look for a link in that Google Maps interface to either go to their website or see what their order online version is. Part of that is because it's like a normal behavior for me, but part of it's also because I want to understand how other brands are doing it so that I can learn things for our restaurants. So I'm learning how they're employing different types of technology. But at the end of the day, I think to your point, like the question I have is, am I losing some level of customers by having AI phone ordering for my restaurants? Does somebody who's my age but prefers to order by phone not order because they don't like the that experience? And the bet I think that we're taking right now is that no, they still find a way to place the order. And so I think like looping all the way back around to your Klarna example, I would imagine that the majority of people who are calling Klarna to resolve an issue are infrequent Klarna users who are skew older and skew less technical.
Yes.
A 20 something who, does everything from their phone doesn't want to talk to a human. Like it's just we've seen that behavior. They want to use the kiosk in the restaurant. They want to order online. They don't want to talk to a human, so they'll do it as a last resort. And so I would imagine the requests that Klarna is getting are people who are like, they bought a new bed and they got to the final screen of the ordering and there was this button to click for Klarna and they're like, all right, fine, I'll do this, free up some cash flow for the next few months. And then they decide they want to do something different. Like, well, how do I get out of this Klarna thing?
The uncomfortable part of all this is that the people that are not listening to this show are the ones that are that are going to be the most impacted by this. And I don't mean to sound judgmental or anything like that. What I'm just trying to say is that let's just go back to this Klarna tweet and let's take it at face value. He said something like 2/3 of the support requests were handled, right?
Right.
Well, what does that mean about the other 1/3? The other 1/3 needed to be escalated or they were a little bit more complex. They had to be, but the people most at risk are probably the tier one customer support, like the first line of support
Yep.
that now are no longer necessary because 2/3 of those requests were probably simple enough for an AI model to point them in the right direction. Technology always comes after the middlemen and women of every industry. And I know that's like uncomfortable to think about, but like when you think about the printing press, well, the printing press put a lot of calligraphers out of jobs, right? But again, this is all going to be context specific. I know for me as a consumer, if I am delayed and I need a connection to another flight to get home for the kids or something like that, the last thing I want to do is take the risk of a chatbot. I want to talk to a human being, and I'm willing to pay for that.
I want to end on one point from his tweet that that honestly still kind of blows me away. Mostly because I think of Klarna sort of like Affirm and these other companies where they're new tech enabled companies. I don't know how long Klarna's been around, but like I would imagine they would embrace tech fairly heavily, and they would find like American Airlines is not a company that I would call a new tech enabled company. They are, they have lots of humans doing things that tech could do. Sebastian's tweet says that they use 3,000 full-time customer service agents. 3,000. 3,000. It's a massive number of people.
And that's why, I mean, again, I don't know him, but just, thinking about this as a capitalist, for better or for worse, that's why that 700 number is so important, because 3,000 support people are not cheap. And
No.
now not having to have 3,700.
They can't go work at Blockbuster, man. They can't. That job's gone too. So, and
Oh yeah.
that probably seems like a good place to land the plane.
Oh man.
No pun intended.
I feel like we ended it on a pessimistic note. That's terrible.
No, look, the people who used to work at Blockbuster found new jobs, man. It just is what it is.
Yeah.
This is
It is what it is. That's right.
technology as a general rule is deflationary. Like it just is what it is. Innovation is deflationary, and then as a society we create more innovation. Just to remind folks where we started the day, Paul, you have homework to do.
Check your email this evening.
Yeah, in the immortal words of me, I'll believe it when I see it.